Do you know how much this car is worth? The woman's voice cut through the autumn air before the engines had even gone silent. A crowd was already beginning to gather in the parking lot of Miller's Hardware on the edge of Ashford, Pennsylvania. Some looked at the sleek black Bentley. Others looked at the old Ford F-150 with faded paint and a dented tailgate. Most had already decided who was important and who wasn't. Charlotte Hayes stepped out first. Her heels touched the pavement with practiced confidence. At 34, she carried herself the same way financial magazines described her company: precise, polished, and impossible to ignore. She glanced at the scrape along the side of her luxury vehicle and exhaled sharply. This is unbelievable. Across from her, Ethan Walker climbed out of his truck. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his worn flannel jacket and checked on the little girl sitting in the passenger seat. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked. Lily nodded. "I'm okay, Dad." Only then did Ethan turn toward Charlotte. "Looks like nobody's hurt," he said quietly. "That's what matters." Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. The truck looked older than some of the employees in her headquarters. The paint had faded beneath years of Pennsylvania winters. The chrome bumper carried scratches from decades of work. Yet somehow the man standing beside it seemed completely unconcerned. "You realize the damage to my car alone could cost more than that truck is worth?" she said. A few people chuckled. Ethan didn't. He simply glanced toward the scratch and then back at her. Maybe. His calm response only irritated her more. She was used to arguments, used to people apologizing, used to lawyers, assistants, and executives scrambling whenever something went wrong. But this man stood there with a kind of quiet dignity that couldn't be rushed. The wind moved through the orange leaves overhead. Somewhere nearby, a church bell echoed across town. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lily opened the truck door and stepped down carefully. Charlotte's expression softened for only a second when she saw the child. The little girl held a sketchbook against her chest and stayed close to her father. "Dad," Lily whispered, tugging gently at his sleeve. "It's okay." Ethan smiled at her. "I know." There was something about that smile. Something steady. Something earned. Charlotte found herself studying him more closely. The calloused hands. The faded work boots. The tired eyes that somehow still looked kind. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't impressed by her name, her car, or her wealth. It was as if none of it mattered. Then Ethan reached into the cab of the truck to retrieve some paperwork. As he opened the door wider, something slipped from the dashboard compartment and landed on the seat. Charlotte only caught a glimpse. A small leather box, worn with age, protected carefully. Ethan noticed it immediately. Faster than any reaction he'd shown all afternoon, he picked it up and tucked it away. But not before Charlotte saw the initials engraved into the leather. R.H. Her heart skipped. Richard Hayes. Her father's initials. For the first time since the accident, her confidence cracked. Ethan looked up and met her eyes. Neither spoke. The parking lot noise seemed to fade into the distance. Because Charlotte Hayes had just crashed into the last man on earth who still carried a piece of her father. And Ethan Walker suddenly realized that the woman standing before him was the daughter of the man whose final secret he had protected for 7 long years. Charlotte Hayes did not sleep that night. The lights of her penthouse overlooking downtown Pittsburgh glowed against the dark glass walls, but her attention remained fixed on something far smaller than the city below. A pair of initials. R.H. She had seen them for only a second before Ethan Walker tucked the leather box away. Yet the image refused to leave her mind. Richard Hayes, her father, the man whose face still stared down from framed magazine covers and company headquarters portraits 7 years after his death. Charlotte stood beside the window, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. None of it made sense. Her father had never mentioned an Ethan Walker, never mentioned a truck mechanic from a small Pennsylvania town, never mentioned entrusting anything to a stranger. Yet the look on Ethan's face had not been confusion. It had been recognition. Across town, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to bed. The old farmhouse was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional rustle of leaves against the windows. The leather box rested in front of him. His fingers traced the worn edges carefully. 7 years. 7 years of keeping a promise. 7 years of silence. He opened the box slowly. Inside lay a silver pocket watch. The metal had dulled with age, but the engraving remained clear. Richard Hayes. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. Memories drifted through his mind like distant echoes. A rainy night. A desperate conversation. A promise made between two fathers. He closed the box again. Some secrets were not meant to be revealed too early. The next morning, Charlotte made a decision. By 9 o'clock, she was sitting across from a private investigator in one of the executive conference rooms at Hayes Industries. "I want everything you can find on Ethan Walker," she said. The investigator nodded. "Business records?" "Everything." By noon, the first report arrived. Charlotte expected debts, lawsuits, or hidden motives. Instead, she found something entirely different. Ethan Walker, age 42. Widower. Single father. Owner of a small repair garage outside Ashford. No criminal history. No financial scandals. No unexplained wealth. Nothing. The file was almost painfully ordinary. Yet one detail caught her attention. Over the past 7 years, Ethan had quietly turned down multiple offers to sell family property, including one offer worth nearly $800,000. Charlotte frowned. Most people would have accepted immediately. Ethan had not. The more she read, the less he fit the picture she had imagined. That afternoon, she drove back to Ashford. The autumn sun hung low above the hills as she pulled into Walker Auto Repair. The garage doors stood open. The scent of motor oil mixed with fresh air drifting across nearby fields. Ethan was beneath the hood of an aging pickup truck. He looked up when her Bentley rolled into the lot. Neither seemed surprised to see the other. Charlotte stepped out and walked toward him. "I have a question." Ethan wiped his hands with a shop towel. "I figured you might." "That box." Ethan remained silent. "The one with my father's initials." Still nothing. Charlotte crossed her arms. "Why do you have it?" Ethan looked toward the horizon for a moment before meeting her eyes. His voice was calm. "Because your father asked me to keep it." The answer landed harder than any argument could have. Charlotte's breath caught. "For 7 years?" Ethan nodded once. "For as long as necessary." The wind stirred through the open garage doors. Somewhere behind them, Lily laughed while drawing pictures at a workbench. The simple sound seemed strangely out of place against the weight of the moment. Charlotte stared at Ethan, searching for dishonesty, searching for an angle, searching for something she could understand. Instead, she found only quiet certainty. And for the first time since her father's death, she began to wonder if the man she thought she knew had been keeping secrets too. Charlotte drove back to Pittsburgh with more questions than answers. The rolling Pennsylvania hills faded behind her windshield, but Ethan Walker's words refused to leave her mind. "Your father asked me to keep it." The sentence echoed over and over. By the time she reached Hayes Industries headquarters, the sun was already setting behind the glass towers downtown. Employees hurried through the lobby carrying laptops and coffee cups while stock prices scrolled across digital screens. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet for the first time in years, Charlotte felt like a stranger inside her own company. She stepped into her office and stared at the massive portrait hanging on the wall behind her desk. Richard Hayes smiled confidently from the frame, the same expression millions of shareholders associated with success. Charlotte had spent years protecting his legacy. She thought she knew every chapter of his life. Now she was no longer sure. The next morning, another report arrived from the investigator. Charlotte opened it immediately. There was still nothing suspicious about Ethan. No hidden accounts. No secret properties. No connections to competitors. If anything, the report made him look even more ordinary. He coached youth baseball in the spring. He volunteered at community food drives. He spent most weekends at his daughter's school events. The investigator had added one handwritten note at the bottom. "Everyone in town seems to trust him." Charlotte read the sentence twice. Trust. It was becoming a pattern. Her father had trusted him. An entire town trusted him. Yet she still did not know why. Later that afternoon, she received a call from an elderly attorney named Walter Simmons. The name caught her attention immediately. Walter had been one of her father's closest legal advisors for decades before retiring. "Charlotte," the old man said gently, "I heard you have been asking questions about Ethan Walker." Charlotte sat upright. "You know him?" A brief silence followed. "I know your father knew him." Her pulse quickened. "Why did nobody ever tell me?" Walter sighed softly. "Because Richard specifically asked that certain matters remain private." Charlotte walked toward the window overlooking the city. "Private from his own daughter?" "Not forever," Walter replied. "Only until the time was right." The answer frustrated her even more. What does that even mean? But Walter offered no further explanation. Before ending the call, he said something that stayed with her long after the line went silent. Your father respected a lot of people in his life. Very few earned his complete trust. Ethan Walker was one of them. That evening, Charlotte found herself driving back to Ashford again. She told herself she needed answers. The truth was more complicated. Curiosity had become something deeper. The garage was closing when she arrived. The sky glowed orange above the fields, and the scent of cut grass drifted through the cooling air. Ethan was locking up for the night, while Lily sat nearby, finishing homework at a small table. "You came back," Ethan said. Charlotte nodded. "I spoke to Walter Simmons." Ethan paused briefly. "Then you already know more than you did yesterday." "Not enough." Ethan looked toward Lily. The little girl was focused on her math workbook, humming quietly to herself. Charlotte noticed how often Ethan checked on her without even realizing it. Every few seconds his eyes drifted toward his daughter, making sure she was smiling, making sure she was safe. It reminded her of someone. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. She was 10 years old again, sitting in the back seat of her father's car, while Richard Hayes glanced into the mirror every few moments during a snowstorm. The same protective look, the same quiet concern. The memory hit harder than she expected. Ethan noticed her expression change. "You okay?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated. Then she asked the question that had been growing inside her for days. "Why you?" The garage fell silent. Ethan studied her carefully before answering. "Honestly." Charlotte nodded. Ethan looked down at his hands. "I spent 7 years asking myself that same question." And for the first time, Charlotte realized that whatever secret her father had left behind, Ethan had never viewed it as a privilege. He had carried it like a responsibility. The question lingered between them long after the garage lights were turned off. "Why you?" Ethan locked the final door and slipped the keys into his pocket. For a moment, he looked older than his 42 years, not because of age, but because of memory. Lily finished gathering her school supplies and waved at Charlotte before heading toward the truck. The evening air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Ashford was settling into another quiet Pennsylvania night. Charlotte stood beside her car and waited. She sensed that Ethan was standing at the edge of a story he had spent years refusing to tell. Finally, he spoke. It started during a storm. Charlotte remained silent. Ethan leaned against the fender of his truck. His eyes drifted toward the dark horizon. 7 years ago, right before Christmas. The memory returned with surprising clarity. Rain hammered the roof of his old garage that night. Business had been slow. Bills were piling up. Lily was only 3 years old and asleep in a small office chair beneath a blanket. Ethan remembered staring at an overdue electric bill when headlights appeared outside. A black sedan pulled into the gravel lot. The driver stepped out carrying an umbrella. Ethan recognized him immediately. Almost everyone in Pennsylvania recognized Richard Hayes. Yet the billionaire had arrived alone. No assistants. No security. No cameras. Just a tired father standing in the rain. "Mr. Hayes?" Ethan had asked. Richard smiled faintly. "I need a favor." Back in the present, Charlotte listened carefully. The cool wind tugged gently at her hair. "A favor?" she asked. Ethan nodded. That is what he called it. He opened the truck door and sat behind the wheel, but he did not start the engine. The story seemed easier to tell while looking forward instead of directly at her. "He spent nearly 2 hours in my garage that night." Charlotte frowned. "Doing what?" Ethan gave a small smile. "Talking." The answer surprised her. Richard Hayes had been one of the busiest executives in America. Yet Ethan described him not as a billionaire, but as a man searching for someone willing to listen. "He talked about the company," Ethan said. "He talked about mistakes. He talked about pressure." Charlotte folded her arms. "My father never talked about those things with me." Ethan's expression softened. "I think that is because he wanted to protect you." Silence followed. Somewhere nearby, a train whistle echoed through the darkness. The sound rolled across the hills before fading away. Ethan continued. "Before he left, he handed me a leather box." Charlotte's heartbeat quickened. "The same one. The same one." Ethan looked down at his hands. "Then he asked me to make a promise." "What promise?" Ethan hesitated. For years he had guarded every detail. Even now the habit was difficult to break. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I was not to give it to anyone until the right moment." Charlotte stepped closer. "And how were you supposed to know when that moment came?" Ethan looked directly at her. The answer was immediate. Certain. Unshaken by 7 years of waiting. He said I would know when his daughter was finally ready to search for the truth instead of running from it. The words landed softly, yet Charlotte felt them more deeply than she expected. The billionaire she had spent years trying to honor suddenly felt less like a legend and more like a father. A father who had seen something coming long before anyone else. And standing beneath the fading autumn sky, Charlotte began to realize that the secret inside the leather box might not be about money, power, or business at all. It might be about her. Charlotte left Ashford with a restless mind. The highway lights stretched across the darkness like ribbons of gold, but her thoughts remained fixed on one sentence. He said I would know when his daughter was finally ready to search for the truth instead of running from it. By the time she reached Pittsburgh, she could no longer ignore the feeling growing inside her. For years she had protected her father's public legacy. Now she wondered if she had avoided understanding the private man behind it. The next morning brought an unexpected interruption. Charlotte entered the executive boardroom on the 32nd floor of Hayes Industries and immediately sensed tension. Conversations stopped when she walked in. Several board members exchanged brief glances. Others focused on their tablets. At the far end of the table sat Victor Langford, a senior board member who had worked beside Richard Hayes for nearly 2 decades. His silver hair was perfectly groomed. His smile was polite, yet something about it felt forced. "Charlotte," Victor said warmly, "we were hoping to discuss next quarter's expansion plans." Charlotte took her seat. "Then let us discuss them." The meeting began normally, but before long Victor shifted the conversation. "I heard you have been spending time in Ashford recently." Charlotte looked up. "Have I?" A few nervous laughs moved around the room. Victor folded his hands. "People notice things." Charlotte remained calm. "And what exactly are people noticing?" Victor's smile tightened slightly. "A mechanic named Ethan Walker." The room became unusually quiet. Charlotte felt every eye settle on her. "Why is that anyone's concern?" she asked. Victor leaned back in his chair. "Because your father's legacy attracts attention. Sometimes the wrong kind." Charlotte studied him carefully. "What do you know about Ethan Walker?" "Very little," Victor answered quickly. Too quickly. The response lingered in her mind long after the meeting ended. That afternoon she drove back to Ashford once again. She found Ethan repairing a tractor behind the garage, while Lily sat nearby reading a library book. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the property. Everything felt peaceful, honest, a world away from polished boardrooms and corporate politics. Charlotte stepped out of her car. "Someone asked about you today." Ethan looked up from his work. "That happens occasionally." Victor Langford. The wrench in Ethan's hand stopped moving. Only for a moment. But Charlotte noticed. "You know him?" Ethan slowly set the tool down. "I have met him. My father trusted him." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. "Your father trusted a lot of people." Charlotte frowned. "What does that mean?" Ethan looked toward Lily before answering. "It means trust is not the same thing as character." The words settled heavily between them. A cold breeze moved through the fields. Leaves drifted across the gravel lot. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Ethan walked into the garage office and returned carrying the leather box. Charlotte's breath caught. It was the first time he had willingly brought it into the open. He placed it carefully on a workbench between them. "There is a reason your father waited," Ethan said quietly. "Once this box is opened, some people will be grateful." He paused. "Others will wish it had stayed closed forever." Charlotte stared at the worn leather surface. For the first time, the secret felt larger than her family, larger than memory, larger than grief. Somewhere far beyond the quiet town of Ashford, forces she could not yet see were already paying attention. And for the first time in 7 years, the promise Richard Hayes left behind was beginning to move toward the moment it had been waiting for. The leather box sat between them on the workbench while the afternoon sunlight filtered through the garage windows in long golden beams. Dust drifted slowly through the air. The hum of distant traffic faded beyond the fields. For 7 years the box had remained closed. For 7 years Ethan Walker had honored a promise made to a man who could no longer speak for himself. Now the moment Richard Hayes had predicted seemed closer than ever. Charlotte stared at the worn leather surface. Her pulse felt unusually loud in the quiet room. "What is inside?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at the box for a long moment before answering. "The truth your father wanted you to hear from him, not from me." Charlotte swallowed. "Then open it." Ethan slowly shook his head. "Not here." The answer surprised her. "Why not?" Ethan glanced toward the front office where Lily sat drawing pictures beside the window. The little girl occasionally looked up and smiled whenever she caught her father's eye. Because some moments deserve privacy, Ethan said, and some words should be heard without distractions. As if on cue, a pickup truck rolled into the parking lot. A local farmer stepped out to ask about a repair estimate. The interruption broke the tension. Charlotte understood what Ethan meant. This was not a conversation for a garage filled with customers and ringing telephones. An hour later they sat inside Ethan's farmhouse kitchen. The room smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. Family photographs lined the walls. Most showed Lily growing up over the years. Some showed Ethan's late wife smiling beside them before illness had changed everything. The home felt simple, honest. Nothing about it resembled the world Charlotte came from. Yet strangely, she felt more comfortable here than she had inside her penthouse in months. Ethan placed the leather box carefully on the table. Lily had gone to a neighbor's house for the evening. The farmhouse had become completely still. Only the ticking of a clock echoed softly from another room. Ethan opened the box. Inside rested the silver pocket watch Charlotte had glimpsed before. Beneath it lay a sealed envelope. Her breath caught immediately. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Charlotte, if you are reading this, then Ethan finally decided it was time. Tears formed before she even realized it. She had not seen her father's handwriting in years. Carefully, she reached for the envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly. Ethan remained silent. This was no longer his story. Charlotte broke the seal. A folded letter slid into her hands. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. She unfolded it slowly and began to read. The first line stopped her cold. My sweet Charlotte, if life has unfolded the way I fear it might, then you probably spent years believing you knew everything about me. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She blinked and continued. The letter was not about money, not about business, not about company strategy. It was a father speaking directly to his daughter. Richard wrote about regret, about missed birthdays caused by meetings, about opportunities he never got back, about how success often came at a cost he had hidden from the world. Charlotte read quietly while the evening light faded outside the kitchen windows. Every sentence revealed a side of Richard Hayes she had never seen. Then she reached the final paragraph on the first page. The words changed everything. There is a reason I trusted Ethan Walker. Before I tell you the secret I have carried for years, you need to understand that he saved something far more important than my company. He saved my faith in people. Charlotte lowered the letter slowly. Her eyes lifted toward Ethan. Neither spoke. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence that comes when a lifetime of assumptions begins to crack open and something deeper finally starts to emerge. Charlotte sat motionless at the kitchen table while the letter rested in her hands. Outside, evening settled across the Pennsylvania countryside. The last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the fields, leaving only the warm glow of the farmhouse lights. For several moments, she could not continue reading. Her father's words had already revealed more honesty than she had heard from him during the final years of his life. Across the table, Ethan remained quiet. He understood that some truths needed room to breathe. Eventually, Charlotte lowered her eyes and continued. The next page began differently. The handwriting looked slightly rushed, as though Richard had been writing against time itself. Charlotte, there is something I never told the board, never told the press, and never told even those closest to me. 7 years ago, I discovered that not everyone surrounding our company shared the values upon which it was built. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. She kept reading. I spent months investigating quietly. I found patterns that troubled me, decisions that benefited a few while hurting many. I realized that some people valued power more than character. The room seemed smaller now. The ticking clock sounded louder. Ethan watched her expression change with every line. Richard never named anyone directly. Instead, he described his growing disappointment. He wrote about board meetings where integrity was treated as an obstacle. He wrote about conversations that left him questioning whom he could trust. Then came the paragraph that made Charlotte stop breathing for a moment. The day I met Ethan Walker, I was not searching for a mechanic. I was searching for proof that good people still existed. Tears filled her eyes again. She continued reading. Ethan did not know who I was when we first spoke. He did not ask for favors. He did not seek opportunity. He treated me with the same respect he would offer any stranger. In a world where everyone wanted something from me, he wanted nothing. Charlotte looked up at Ethan. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Praise had never sat well with him. He always exaggerated, Ethan said softly. Charlotte shook her head. No, she looked back at the page. I do not think he did. The next section revealed something even more surprising. Richard explained that he had begun visiting Ashford periodically over the following months. Sometimes they spoke about business. More often they spoke about family, about fatherhood, about mistakes, about second chances. Richard wrote that Ethan reminded him of the person he had once hoped to become before ambition consumed so much of his life. Then Charlotte reached the final page. Her eyes widened. Folded inside was another document, a notarized statement bearing Richard Hayes' signature. Attached to it was a small key. What is this? She whispered. Ethan slowly nodded toward the papers. Keep reading. Charlotte unfolded the final sheet. Her father's last words seemed almost to echo through the room. If you are holding this document, then Ethan has decided you are ready. The enclosed key opens a private safety deposit box that has remained sealed since my death. Inside you will find evidence, records, and the full truth. The truth I could not reveal while I was alive. Charlotte stared at the key resting in her palm. It felt impossibly small for something carrying so much weight. Then she noticed the final sentence at the bottom of the page. The sentence that explained everything. If anyone attempts to stop you from opening that box, pay very close attention. Because those are the people I was trying to protect you from. The farmhouse fell completely silent. Even the clock seemed to stop. For years Charlotte had believed her father left behind a legacy of success. Now she realized he had also left behind a warning. And somewhere beyond the peaceful fields surrounding Ethan's home, people who thought the past was safely buried had no idea that Richard Hayes was about to speak again. The following morning arrived gray and cold. Low clouds drifted across the Pittsburgh skyline, while Charlotte stood outside a downtown bank building holding the small key her father had left behind. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the final sentence from the letter. If anyone attempts to stop you from opening that box, pay very close attention. Ethan stood beside her in his worn flannel jacket, hands tucked into his pockets against the chill. He had insisted on coming, not because he wanted answers for himself, but because he had promised Richard Hayes he would see this through to the end. Together, they entered the marble lobby. The bank manager greeted Charlotte immediately and escorted them downstairs. Deep beneath the building, behind steel doors and silent corridors, waited a safety deposit box that had remained untouched for 7 years. The manager verified documents, examined signatures, and finally inserted a master key beside Charlotte's. A soft click echoed through the room. Then he stepped away to give them privacy. Charlotte opened the box carefully. Inside sat several folders, a flash drive, and a sealed envelope marked for Charlotte only. She stared at the contents in silence. Richard Hayes had known this day would come. Every document had been organized with precise care. The first folder contained internal correspondence from years earlier. Charlotte read page after page. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Certain executives had quietly redirected resources, manipulated reports, and concealed critical information from shareholders. Nothing criminal appeared on the surface. Everything had been designed to look legitimate. Yet together the records revealed a culture Richard had desperately tried to stop. Charlotte's expression darkened with every page. Ethan remained silent beside her. Then she opened the envelope. A handwritten note slipped out. Charlotte, if you are reading this, then the evidence confirmed what I feared. Some of the people entrusted with protecting this company were slowly changing its soul. Success without character eventually becomes failure. Never forget that. Tears filled her eyes again. Hours later, they returned to headquarters carrying copies of everything. By then, Charlotte had made a decision. An emergency board meeting would be held the following morning. Every director would attend. Every senior executive would be present. News of the meeting spread quickly through the company. The next day, the boardroom was filled long before Charlotte arrived. Conversations stopped the moment she entered. Victor Langford sat at the far end of the table. His confident smile looked less certain than before. Charlotte placed several folders on the table. Ethan sat quietly near the back wall. A mechanic from Ashford had never expected to enter a room like this. Yet somehow he appeared calmer than many of the executives. Charlotte began speaking. She shared portions of her father's letter. She presented records from the safety deposit box. She displayed years of documentation that Richard had preserved. Faces around the room shifted from confidence to concern. Some looked stunned. Others looked away. Victor's expression slowly hardened. "This proves nothing," he said. Charlotte did not argue. Instead, she connected the flash drive to the conference screen. "Then perhaps my father can explain it himself." A video appeared. Richard Hayes filled the screen. Older, tired, honest. The room instantly fell silent. He spoke calmly about integrity, about leadership, about protecting future generations. Then he described specific decisions and the individuals responsible for them. No anger, no bitterness, just truth. By the time the video ended, nobody in the room was speaking. Nobody was checking phones. Nobody was looking at stock prices. The silence felt enormous. Victor stared at the table. Several board members removed their glasses and rubbed their eyes. Others simply sat frozen. Charlotte looked across the room and finally understood the promise Ethan had been carrying all these years. It was never about exposing people. It was about giving the truth a chance to be heard. And in that moment, the most powerful voices in the company had nothing left to say. 3 weeks later, the first snow of the season drifted gently across Ashford. White flakes settled on rooftops, fence posts, and the old Ford truck parked outside Walker Auto Repair. The world seemed quieter now, slower, as if even the town itself had taken a deep breath after everything that had happened. Inside the garage, Ethan was finishing paperwork while holiday music played softly from an old radio. The past few weeks had brought unexpected changes. Hayes Industries had announced major reforms. Several senior leaders had stepped down. New policies focused on transparency, accountability, and community investment had been introduced. News outlets called it one of the most remarkable corporate transformations in recent memory. Ethan ignored most of the headlines. He still opened the garage every morning before sunrise. He still fixed engines. He still packed Lily's school lunches. Some things mattered more than attention. The bell above the office door chimed softly. Ethan looked up and smiled immediately. Charlotte Hayes stepped inside, carrying a cardboard box wrapped with a red ribbon. Snowflakes sparkled in her hair before melting from the warmth of the room. "You know," Ethan said, "most billionaires send emails." Charlotte laughed. "And miss seeing your face when I walk through the door?" Lily appeared from the back room, holding a sketchbook. "Charlotte," she shouted before running over. Charlotte knelt and hugged her warmly. Somewhere along the way, the visits had become regular. No business meetings. No investigations. No secrets. Just conversations. Shared dinners. Small moments that slowly stitched together a friendship none of them had expected. Charlotte handed the box to Ethan. "What is this?" he asked. "Open it." Ethan carefully untied the ribbon. Inside rested a framed photograph. He stared at it in surprise. The picture showed Richard Hayes standing outside the garage on that rainy night 7 years earlier. Both men were smiling. Neither looked important. Neither looked powerful. They simply looked like two fathers sharing a conversation. Ethan swallowed hard. "Where did you find this?" Charlotte smiled softly. "My father kept it in a private album." For a moment, nobody spoke. Snow drifted past the windows. The old radio continued playing quietly in the background. Then Charlotte reached into her coat pocket and removed the silver pocket watch. She placed it gently beside the photograph. "This belongs here," she said. Ethan looked at the watch, then at the photograph, then back at Charlotte. "Are you sure?" Charlotte nodded. "My father trusted you with it." "I finally understand why." Emotion filled the room, but it was not sadness. It was gratitude, respect, the kind of peace that arrives when truth no longer has to hide. Later that evening, after Charlotte stayed for dinner, the three of them sat around the farmhouse table, sharing homemade chili and cornbread. Lily talked endlessly about school projects and Christmas plans. Ethan listened with quiet amusement. Charlotte found herself laughing more than she had in years. At one point, she glanced toward the framed photograph resting on a nearby shelf. Richard Hayes smiled back from the picture. Not as a billionaire, not as a corporate legend, just as a father. And somehow that version meant more. When the evening finally ended, Charlotte stood on the porch preparing to leave. Snowflakes drifted beneath the porch light. Ethan walked her to her car. Neither rushed to say goodbye. "He chose the right person," Charlotte said softly. Ethan looked toward the farmhouse window where Lily waved from inside. "Your father?" Charlotte nodded. Ethan smiled. "No," he glanced back toward the warm light glowing from the house. "I think he chose the right daughter." Charlotte felt tears form in her eyes as she looked at the home, the truck, the garage, and the life she had almost driven past without ever truly seeing. The snow continued to fall. The world remained quiet. And somewhere beyond the winter sky, a father's final promise had finally become something even greater than a secret. It had become a second chance,